fluorescent lights buzzed overhead at Logan International Airport as Jake Thompson adjusted his security uniform, his fingers drumming against his holster, a nervous habit he'd developed over his 15 years on the force. The morning crowd moved through the security checkpoints like a slow-moving river, faces blurred with travel fatigue and anxiety. "You're doing it again," Lisa Carter said, nudging her partner's arm. She'd only been working with Jake for 2 years, but she'd learned to read his tells. "That drumming means you're overthinking." Jake stopped immediately, forcing his hand to his side. "Just one of those days. Rodriguez called in sick again, so we're understaffed." He scanned the growing line of passengers, his trained eyes moving methodically from face to face. "Makes me wonder if he's really sick or just avoiding the internal affairs investigation." Lisa's expression tightened. The department had been under increased scrutiny lately, with accusations of profiling floating around. "Speaking of which, did you finish your statement for the Harrison case?" "Let's not go there," Jake muttered, his attention caught by movement near Checkpoint 3. "What matters is keeping these people safe. 20 years ago, my old man worked this same terminal. Things were different then. Simpler. Different doesn't always mean better," Lisa replied, watching a young mother struggling with her stroller. She moved to help, but Jake caught her arm. "Hold up. 2 o'clock, gray suit," he whispered, nodding toward a well-dressed man checking his watch repeatedly. "Third time he's looked at his phone in 2 minutes." Lisa observed the passenger discreetly. "Could just be running late for a flight. It's hardly suspicious behavior." "Or he's coordinating with someone," Jake insisted, his years of experience feeding into a growing certainty. "Look at his body language. He keeps scanning the exits." The line inched forward. Jake's focus remained fixed on the man in the gray suit, who was now making a brief phone call. Lisa noticed beads of sweat on the passenger's forehead, despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning. "I'm going to talk to him," Jake decided, already moving forward. "Jake, wait," Lisa called after him, but her partner was already approaching the man. She hurried to catch up, noting the curious glances from other passengers. The morning light streaming through the terminal's high windows cast long shadows across the floor as they closed in on their target. The man looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from distraction to confusion as the 2 officers approached. Jake's hand rested near his weapon, not drawing it, but ready. Lisa positioned herself slightly to the left, maintaining their standard approach formation. "Sir, could you step aside for a moment?" Jake's voice carried the authority of his position, firm but not yet aggressive. The man's eyes widened, darting between the 2 officers as other passengers began to stare. What happened next would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. The morning light continued to stream through the windows. The security line continued to inch forward, and somewhere in the terminal, a phone camera began to record. "I'm sorry, but I have a flight to catch," the man said, reaching for his briefcase. Jake stepped closer, blocking his path. "Sir, I need to see your credentials," Jake insisted, his voice growing firmer. The man's hand moved toward his inner jacket pocket, causing Jake to tense visibly. "Slowly," Jake commanded, his hand now firmly on his holster. The man froze, then carefully extracted a diplomatic passport and identification card. "My name is Elijah Robinson. I'm a United States ambassador to France, and I'm late for a diplomatic flight," he stated calmly, though his jaw was clenched. Lisa noticed his perfectly tailored suit, his Oxford University ring, and the subtle but expensive watch on his wrist. Something wasn't adding up. Jake barely glanced at the credentials. These could be fake. We've seen plenty of sophisticated forgeries lately. "Officer Thompson?" Lisa interjected, recognizing the situation was escalating. She'd seen Elijah Robinson on the news just last week, discussing international trade agreements. But before she could continue, Jake cut her off. "Carter, maintain the perimeter," he ordered, turning back to Elijah. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us for additional screening." By now, phones were out. A young woman in line had been recording since Jake's initial approach. Her hands shook slightly as she captured the unfolding scene, the video already uploading to social media platforms. "This is absurd," Elijah stated, his diplomatic training evident in his measured tone. "I suggest you contact your supervisor immediately." Jake reached for Elijah's briefcase. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them." The video spread like wildfire. Within minutes, it was being shared across multiple platforms. The caption read, "U.S. Ambassador racially profiled at Logan International. Happening now. Police brutality. Racism." Later that evening, Lisa sat in her apartment, the blue light from her laptop screen illuminating her face as she watched the video for the 20th time. Her stomach churned as she saw herself standing there, doing nothing while Jake escalated the situation. The comment section was brutal. "Look at the female officer just standing there. They're all the same. The whole system is corrupt. That's Ambassador Robinson. How dare they?" She closed her laptop, but couldn't escape the memory of Elijah Robinson's face, the careful control of his expression, the dignity he maintained even as Jake treated him like a common criminal. Lisa had met him once before, at a community outreach event. He'd been warm, engaging, passionate about building bridges between communities. Her phone buzzed again, another message from the department's PR team about the mandatory press conference tomorrow. They wanted all officers involved to present a unified front. Lisa stared at the message, her finger hovering over the reply button. The carefully constructed narrative they wanted her to support felt like ash in her mouth. Outside her window, police sirens wailed in the distance. For the first time in her career, the sound made her flinch. Jake's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, driving through the familiar streets of his childhood neighborhood. The small, well-maintained house where his father still lived appeared ahead, its American flag hanging limp in the evening air. He needed someone who would understand, someone who'd been there. Frank Thompson opened the door before Jake could knock, as if he'd been waiting. At 68, the former police sergeant still maintained his commanding presence, though his hair had gone completely gray. "Saw the news," he said gruffly, stepping aside to let his son in. "Media's having a field day with this one." Inside, the house smelled of coffee and gun oil, his father's evening ritual of cleaning his service weapon, even years into retirement. Fox News played quietly in the background, showing clips from the airport incident. "They don't understand what it's like," Frank said, settling into his worn recliner. "Split-second decisions, constant threats. You did your job, son. These diplomats think their badges make them untouchable, but I've seen plenty who use their position to smuggle contraband." Jake sank into the couch, his father's words washing over him like a familiar blanket. "The department's launching an internal investigation. They're talking about sensitivity training, policy reviews, political correctness gone mad," Frank interrupted, his voice hard. "In my day, we trusted our instincts. Now they want you to second-guess everything. That's how good officers get killed." Meanwhile, across town, Lisa stood among a growing crowd outside the police department. Protest signs bobbed in the evening air. "Justice for Ambassador Robinson. End police racism. Reform now." She changed into civilian clothes, but still felt exposed, caught between two worlds. "Officer Carter?" a voice called out. Lisa turned to find Maria Rodriguez, a local community organizer she'd worked with on youth outreach programs. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I needed to see this," Lisa replied, watching as more protesters arrived. "To understand." The crowd's energy shifted as Elijah Robinson approached the makeshift podium. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd fell silent. "What happened to me today is not unique," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. What's unique is my position, which forces people to pay attention. But every day in airports, on streets, in stores across this nation, people who look like me face the same suspicion, the same degradation, the same fear. Lisa felt tears prick at her eyes as Elijah continued, describing not just today's incident, but a lifetime of similar experiences. Being pulled over for driving an expensive car, being followed in high-end stores, having to teach his children how to behave around police to stay alive. Back at Frank Thompson's house, Jake watched the speech on TV, his father's commentary a constant background noise. When I started on the force, Frank was saying, people respected the uniform. Now they film everything twisted around. But Jake was barely listening. He was watching Elijah's face, seeing for the first time not a suspect, but a man, a father, a diplomat, an American, describing a reality Jake had never had to face. The evening ended with two very different scenes. Jake sitting in his childhood home, surrounded by old certainties that suddenly felt hollow, and Lisa, standing in a crowd of protesters, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet as decades of unquestioned beliefs began to crumble. The Internal Affairs conference room felt smaller than usual as Jake sat across from Lieutenant Martinez, the recording device between them casting a red light into the dim space. Outside, another protest had gathered, their chants muffled by the thick windows. "Walk me through your threat assessment, Officer Thompson," Martinez said, her pen poised over a blank notepad. "What specific behaviors triggered your response?" Jake recited the details mechanically. The frequent phone checking, the nervous glances, the hurried movements. But as he spoke, each observation seemed to shrink under the fluorescent lights, becoming smaller, less significant. "And at what point did you check his credentials?" Martinez asked, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. Jake's silence stretched for several seconds. I assumed they were fake." "Based on what evidence?" More silence. Across town, Lisa stood at the edge of Franklin Park, surrounded by young activists who'd recognized her from the viral video. Instead of the hostility she'd expected, they wanted to talk. "I was 12 the first time a cop pulled me over. On my bicycle," a young man named Marcus told her. "Said I matched a description. You know how many times I've matched a description since then?" Another activist, Sarah, stepped forward. "My brother's a medical resident. Still gets stopped driving home from night shifts. Keeps his hospital ID on the dashboard now." Each story hit Lisa like a physical blow. She thought of all the traffic stops she'd conducted, the random searches she'd performed. How many times had she seen only what she expected to see? Later that evening, Jake found himself in his father's attic, surrounded by boxes of family photographs. He was looking for something specific, a VHS tape from his childhood. When he finally found it, the label read, "Jake's First Ride Along, 1994. He set up the old VCR in his living room, watching through static as his 12-year-old self sat proudly in his father's patrol car. "This is how we keep the streets safe, son." His father's younger voice crackled through the speakers. "You've got to trust your gut. Some people just look like trouble." The tape continued, showing them pulling over a car. Jake couldn't remember why. But now, 30 years later, he noticed what his excited 12-year-old self hadn't. The driver's resigned expression, the way he kept his hands visible at all times, the practiced calm in his voice. It was a ritual he'd learned to survive. Jake's phone buzzed. Another message from the police union representative, offering advice for his next internal affairs interview. "Stick to procedure," the text read. "We protect our own." But sitting there in his darkened living room, surrounded by ghosts of the past, Jake wasn't sure what "our own" meant anymore. At the same time, Lisa sat in her car outside the precinct, watching a group of her fellow officers leave for their shift. Their easy laughter, their casual confidence, it all seemed different now. Her phone showed dozens of missed calls from Jake, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Not yet. Not until she figured out what kind of cop, what kind of person she wanted to be. The sun set over Boston, casting long shadows across both their lives. In the growing darkness, certainties that had once seemed solid began to dissolve, leaving behind questions neither of them had been trained to answer. The precinct's largest conference room buzzed with tension as Captain Reynolds addressed the assembled officers. PowerPoint slides displayed departmental statistics and policy bulletins, but everyone knew this meeting was about damage control. "The media is spinning this incident out of proportion," Reynolds stated, his voice carefully measured. "We need to present a unified front. Our department has one of the best records in the state for—" "With all due respect, sir," Lisa interrupted, standing from her seat in the back row. The room fell silent. "Those statistics don't tell the whole story." Jake watched his partner from across the room, noticing how other officers shifted away from her slightly, creating an invisible barrier. He'd seen this before, the subtle ostracism of officers who broke ranks. "Officer Carter," Reynolds warned, "this isn't the time." "When is the time?" Lisa's voice remained steady. "Ambassador Robinson wasn't just another statistic. We profiled him, sir. We were wrong." Jake felt dozens of eyes turn to him. His throat tightened, but he found himself standing too. "She's right. We need to address this." Reynolds' face darkened. "Officers Thompson and Carter, my office, now. Everyone else is dismissed." Meanwhile, across the city, Elijah Robinson stood before a different audience. Camera lights flashed as he launched a new initiative, Communities United for Police Reform. His composed demeanor masked the toll of recent weeks, the death threats, the conservative media attacks, the strain on his family. "This isn't about one incident or one department," he explained to the reporters. "This is about systemic change." His eyes found Lisa in the crowd. She'd come straight from the precinct meeting. Their shared nod was brief, but meaningful. Back in Reynolds' office, the captain's forced patience was wearing thin. "Do you understand what you're doing to department morale? To our reputation?" "Our reputation?" Jake's laugh held no humor. "Sir, I've been reviewing my body cam footage from the past year. The patterns are there. We just didn't want to see them." "Thompson, you're on thin ice." "No," Jake interrupted, surprising himself. "We're all on thin ice. Every stop, every arrest, every decision we've justified with gut feelings. It's all going to come out." Lisa stepped forward. "We want to help implement real changes, training programs, community oversight." "Get out of my office," Reynolds snapped. "Both of you. And Carter, the union rep wants to discuss your extracurricular activities with these protesters." Later that evening, Lisa sat with Elijah in a small coffee shop away from media attention. Steam rose from their untouched cups as they discussed the future. "They'll try to break you," Elijah warned. "Both of you. I've seen it before." Lisa nodded. "I know, but staying silent, that's already broken something in me I can't fix." Across town, Jake faced his own crucible. His phone displayed a text from his father. "You're throwing away everything we built. These people aren't your friends." These people. The phrase hit him like a physical blow, illuminating decades of casual prejudice he'd absorbed without question. The next day's shift briefing felt like entering hostile territory. As Jake and Lisa took their usual seats, the whispers followed them. Their radios would mysteriously malfunction during shifts. Backup would arrive just a little too late. The message was clear. Loyalty to the Brotherhood came first. But as they caught each other's eyes across the briefing room, both felt something stronger than fear. The certainty that they'd finally chosen the right side of history, no matter the cost. The Internal Affairs investigation uncovered patterns that couldn't be ignored. case files spread across investigator Sandra Chen's desk told a story in numbers and incident reports. Traffic stops, suspicious person reports, use of force incidents, all showing clear racial disparities. Jake sat across from Chen, his own personnel file open between them. "Officer Thompson, can you explain why 78% of your discretionary stops involved minorities, despite your patrol area being predominantly white?" The question hung in the air. Jake thought about every routine check he'd conducted, every suspicious person he'd approached. Each decision had seemed justified in the moment, but the numbers painted a damning picture. "No," he finally answered. "No, I can't justify it." Down the hall, other officers waited for their interviews, the tension palpable. The thin blue line was beginning to show cracks. Lisa's phone buzzed during her lunch break. An anonymous number had sent a message. "Race traitors get what they deserve. Watch your back." She showed it to Jake, her hands steady but her eyes concerned. "That's the third one this week," she said quietly. "They're getting bolder." The threats weren't just digital. Lisa's locker had been vandalized, her tires slashed in the precinct parking lot. But each act of intimidation only strengthened her resolve. Meanwhile, Elijah faced his own battles. Death threats had forced his family to relocate temporarily. His children needed security escorts to school. Yet he continued his campaign for police reform, his voice growing stronger as others joined the cause. During a press conference outside City Hall, he addressed the latest developments. "The internal investigation confirms what our communities have known for years. This isn't about bad apples. The entire orchard needs replanting." Back at the precinct, Officer Mike Dawson, a 20-year veteran, cornered Jake in the locker room. "You're gonna testify against your own, Thompson? Your father would be ashamed." "My father was wrong," Jake replied, surprised by how easily the words came now. "We all were." "Wrong?" Dawson stepped closer. "I was there when your old man cleaned up these streets, before all this political correctness garbage. You remember how safe things were?" "Safe for who?" Jake countered, thinking of Marcus's bicycle story, of Sarah's brother with his hospital ID always ready. The tension broke when Lisa entered, her presence unexpected in the male locker room. "Everything okay here?" Dawson backed away, but his parting words carried a clear threat. "You two better watch yourselves. Accidents happen on this job." That evening, Elijah met with his security team to review new threats. A pattern was emerging. Some threats contained details only department insiders would know. The investigation was getting too close to people with everything to lose. "We should postpone tomorrow's community forum," his security chief advised. "No," Elijah insisted. "That's what they want, to silence us through fear." As night fell over Boston, 3 people in different locations prepared for what was coming. Elijah reviewed his speech for tomorrow's forum, his security team scanning the venue one final time. Lisa backed up evidence of the threats to secure servers, knowing technology could be tampered with, and Jake sat in his car outside his father's house, gathering courage for a conversation that would either heal or permanently break their relationship. The old system was fighting back, but change, once started, has its own momentum. The question wasn't if, but how many would be caught in the backlash before truth prevailed. The hearing room's oak panels absorbed the morning light as Jake adjusted his tie, waiting to be called. Outside, protesters and counter-protesters clashed verbally, their chants creating a distant roar. His prepared statement felt heavy in his pocket, each word carefully chosen to expose decades of systemic issues without antagonizing the entire department. "Officer Thompson," the review board chairwoman called, "please raise your right hand." As he stood, Jake caught glimpses of familiar faces in the gallery. His father sat in the back row, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Fellow officers lined the walls, their presence both intimidating and evaluating. In the middle section, Lisa sat next to Elijah Robinson, their unlikely alliance a visible symbol of change. Across town, at the Cambridge Community Center, Lisa had taken her place on a panel discussing police reform. The moderator's introduction felt surreal. Officer Lisa Carter, who recently helped expose racial profiling practices within the Boston Police Department. "I'm not here as a hero," Lisa began, adjusting the microphone. "I'm here as someone who was complicit in a broken system. For years, I told myself I was one of the good ones because I never actively participated in discrimination. But my silence made me equally responsible." The audience leaned forward as she described specific incidents, policies, and the subtle ways bias influenced daily police work. She talked about training that emphasized threat detection while ignoring cultural competency, about promotion systems that rewarded aggressive policing over community building. Back at the hearing, Jake's testimony had reached a crucial point. "The incident with Ambassador Robinson wasn't an anomaly," he stated, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It was the predictable result of ingrained practices and assumptions that we've normalized over generations." "And you participated in these practices?" the chairwoman pressed. "Yes," Jake admitted. "I didn't just participate, I excelled at them. I was promoted because of them. The system rewarded exactly the behavior it now claims to condemn." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jake avoided looking at his father, focusing instead on the facts, the patterns, the evidence he'd helped compile over the past weeks. Meanwhile, at a community event in Roxbury, Elijah addressed a mixed audience of residents and police officers. The tension in the room was palpable, but his diplomatic training served him well. "Reform isn't about punishment," he explained. "It's about recognition and change. Every officer in this room has the power to be part of that change." Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded. One young rookie raised her hand. "But how do we know when we're acting on real suspicion versus bias?" "That," Elijah smiled, "is exactly the right question to ask." The day ended with 3 significant moments. At the hearing, Jake finally looked at his father during a recess, seeing not anger but fear in the older man's eyes. Fear of a world changing too fast, of certainties crumbling. At the community center, Lisa watched young officers engaging with residents, asking questions, listening to stories, beginning to understand. And at his event, Elijah noticed small groups of officers and citizens continuing their discussions long after the formal session ended. Change was happening, not in grand gestures, but in these small moments of recognition, in questions asked and assumptions challenged. The cost was high, careers threatened, relationships strained, safety compromised. But as Jake would later write in his final statement to the review board, the cost of maintaining the status quo is even higher. It's paid in broken trust, lost lives, and a justice system that fails to deliver justice. The sun set over Boston, but the conversations continued, echoing through precincts and communities, challenging decades of ingrained behavior, one difficult question at a time. The pressure inside the police department had reached a breaking point. Jake sat in his patrol car, reviewing an anonymous email he'd received that morning. It contained personnel files, evidence of systematic cover-ups, altered reports, and a network of officers who'd helped conceal discriminatory practices for years. "Delete this if you know what's good for you," the email concluded. But Jake recognized some of the case numbers. They matched incidents he'd witnessed, reports he'd filed without questioning the official narrative. His phone lit up with Lisa's call. "They're moving against Elijah," she said without preamble. "I overheard Dawson and his group. They're planning to plant evidence, discredit the whole reform movement." Inside the precinct, the divide between officers had become physical. Reform supporters occupied one side of the briefing room, while traditionalists claimed the other. Captain Reynolds watched from his office, his authority diminishing as the department fractured. Lisa's investigation had led her to a series of late-night meetings in parking garages. Officers who'd stayed quiet were starting to talk, passing her documents, sharing recordings. Each piece of evidence revealed a deeper layer of institutional corruption. "They've been coordinating with other departments," she told Jake during a secure meeting in her apartment. Papers covered her dining table, internal memos, disciplinary records, civilian complaints that had mysteriously disappeared. "This goes beyond racial profiling. They've been protecting each other from domestic violence charges, DUIs, excessive force complaints." Jake studied a photograph showing several high-ranking officers at a private club known for its exclusionary policies. His father was among them. "How long have you known about this?" "Long enough to know we can't stop it without help," Lisa replied. She pulled out her phone, showing him a message from Elijah. The ambassador had contacts in the Justice Department, people who could protect whistleblowers. That evening, Jake drove to his father's house one last time. Frank Thompson opened the door, wearing his old service weapon, a clear message. "You're investigating the club meetings," Frank said. It wasn't a question. "Did you know what they were planning against Ambassador Robinson?" "You don't understand how things work, son. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty to keep order." "Order for who, Dad?" The question hung between them like smoke. Frank's hand drifted to his weapon. "They'll destroy you, Jake. Everything you've worked for. Everything I built for you." "You taught me to protect and serve," Jake replied. "But you never specified who we were protecting, who we were serving." As Jake left his father's house, his decision was made. He'd testify, not just about the airport incident, but about everything. The evidence on his phone could end dozens of careers, including his father's. At the same time, Lisa was meeting with a group of rookie officers who'd reached out for guidance. Their faces showed the same confusion she'd felt weeks ago, the same struggle between loyalty and justice. "They'll call us traitors," one rookie said. "Maybe," Lisa acknowledged, "but I'd rather be called a traitor to a corrupt system than a traitor to my conscience." Across town, Elijah received the files Jake and Lisa had compiled. His security team doubled as he reviewed them, knowing that the evidence would shake the department to its foundations. The next morning's roll call would change everything. Jake and Lisa had synchronized their phones to release all the evidence simultaneously to multiple news outlets, the Justice Department, and Internal Affairs. There would be no stopping it, no containing the truth. The thin blue line was about to break, and no one could predict who would be left standing when it did. The police department's main conference room had never felt so crowded. Every seat was filled, with additional officers standing along the walls. The Internal Affairs investigation had transformed into a full departmental hearing, complete with media presence and city officials. Jake sat at the witness table, acutely aware of the weight of the USB drive in his pocket, containing every piece of evidence he and Lisa had gathered. Captain Reynolds and the department's legal team sat opposite him, their expressions a mixture of concern and contained anger. "Officer Thompson," the department's attorney began, "your previous testimony painted a concerning picture of departmental practices. However, we have witnesses who tell a very different story." On cue, Officer Dawson approached the podium. His testimony was smooth, rehearsed, a narrative about Jake's growing instability, his tendency to see racism where none existed, his betrayal of department values. "Officer Thompson has been influenced by outside agitators," Dawson concluded, looking directly at Lisa in the gallery. "His partnership with Officer Carter and their connection to Ambassador Robinson has compromised their judgment." Lisa felt the hostility around her intensify, but her attention was on Jake. They had planned for this moment, knowing the old guard would try to discredit them. Her phone buzzed silently, a message from Elijah. "Justice Department representatives are 2 minutes out." Jake stood, interrupting Dawson's testimony. "I request permission to submit new evidence." "Objection," the department's attorney called out. Any new evidence should have been submitted during the discovery phase. But Jake was already connecting his laptop to the room's projection system. This evidence wasn't available during discovery because some of it was actively being covered up. Some of it involves attempts to sabotage this very investigation. The room erupted in murmurs as emails, photographs, and internal memos began appearing on the screen. Jake's voice cut through the chaos. What you're seeing is proof of systematic discrimination, cover-ups, and corruption spanning 2 decades. The conference room doors opened. Federal agents entered, followed by Elijah Robinson and several Justice Department officials. Captain Reynolds half rose from his seat, face pale. "This hearing is now under federal jurisdiction," announced a Justice Department representative. "We have credible evidence of civil rights violations and obstruction of justice." Lisa watched as several officers, including Dawson, tried to leave the room, only to find more federal agents at every exit. Years of protected misconduct were being exposed in real time. Then Frank Thompson stood up from the back of the room. "My son is right." The room fell silent. Frank walked slowly to the front, his former authority still commanding attention. "I helped build this system. I taught these practices to my son, to countless officers. I thought I was protecting order, protecting our way of life. I was wrong." Jake met his father's eyes, seeing for the first time not the intimidating figure of his childhood, but an old man reckoning with his legacy. The evidence continued to scroll across the screen. Racial profiling statistics, altered reports, coordinated harassment of reform advocates, planned sabotage of Elijah's campaign. Each revelation landed like a physical blow to the department's credibility. Lisa moved to stand beside Jake as he continued presenting the evidence. Their partnership, tested by weeks of secret investigations and threats, had become a symbol of the change they sought. Outside, news helicopters circled the building as word spread. Protesters and supporters gathered, sensing that something historic was unfolding. The department's walls of silence, built over generations, were finally crumbling. The old system's defenders were running out of places to hide, and the truth was breaking through decades of carefully maintained darkness. The following week unfolded like a series of shockwaves across Boston. Federal agents occupied the precinct, boxes of documents wheeled out daily. Officer Dawson and several high-ranking officials were led out in handcuffs, charged with conspiracy and civil rights violations. The evidence Jake and Lisa had gathered revealed more than racial profiling. It exposed a complex network of corruption that had infected multiple levels of law enforcement. In a last desperate move, Dawson's supporters launched their attack against Jake's credibility. Anonymous sources fed local media stories about Jake's troubled past, including manufactured evidence of misconduct. But they hadn't anticipated Elijah's influence. "I've spent my career building international coalitions," Elijah announced during a press conference, Lisa and Jake standing beside him. "But the hardest walls to break down are the ones we build in our own communities." These officers risked everything to expose the truth. Their courage exemplifies the best of what law enforcement should be. The city council chambers were packed for the emergency session on police reform. Jake approached the podium, his father unexpectedly at his side. "My father taught me that police work was about protecting people," Jake began. "What I had to learn was that people means everyone, not just those who look like us or live in certain neighborhoods." Frank Thompson took the microphone next, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "I was wrong," he stated simply. "The system I helped build, the practices I defended, they didn't make us safer. They just made us more divided, more afraid." Lisa presented the reform proposal she and Elijah had developed. Mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, revised use of force protocols, and a complete overhaul of internal affairs procedures. But the most radical change was the creation of a joint police community task force with Elijah as its civilian chair. Reform isn't about destroying law enforcement, Lisa explained. It's about rebuilding it to serve everyone equally. The vote was unanimous. As cameras flashed, Jake watched the old guard's power structure finally collapse. Captain Reynolds resigned. Dawson and his conspirators faced federal charges. The thin blue line had been redrawn, not as a barrier between police and community, but as a bridge connecting them. 3 months later, Jake and Lisa stood at the graduation ceremony for the department's first class of officers trained under the new protocols. The class was the most diverse in the department's history. Frank Thompson sat in the audience, watching with a mixture of pride and contemplation as his son addressed the graduates. "Your badge isn't a shield to hide behind," Jake told them. "It's a symbol of public trust, and trust has to be earned every day, with every interaction, with every decision." Elijah's community oversight program had already shown promising results. Civilian complaints were down, while positive community interactions had increased. The media that had once criticized him now celebrated the Boston model of police reform. At the reception afterward, Lisa found herself surrounded by young officers eager to learn from her experience. "The hardest part," she told them, "isn't standing up to bad cops. It's admitting when we ourselves have been part of the problem." As the sun set over Boston, Jake, Lisa, and Elijah stood on the steps of the police headquarters. The building looked the same, but everything inside had changed. "We're not done," Elijah reminded them. "Change this deep takes time." But at least now we're moving in the right direction," Lisa added. Jake watched new recruits entering the building, thinking about how different their experience would be from his own. The department would never be perfect, but it could be better. It would be better. The story made national headlines. Boston Police Department, a model for reform. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the daily interactions between officers and citizens, in the growing trust between communities, in the slow but steady healing of old wounds. The thin blue line hadn't been erased. It had been transformed into something stronger, a connection rather than a barrier, a symbol of protection rather than division.